Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today is a special day. This is the 300th episode of the What If Project, and to celebrate this monumental occasion, I've invited one of my favorite human beings back on the show, someone who's been with me since before the podcast began. His work has made a huge impact on my faith and my life. The one and the only Brian McLaren. So Brian, welcome back. It's always an honor.
Hey, I feel
Confetti
like I
falls
should.
from the
Yeah,
ceiling.
that's
Pop the
right. I feel
champagne.
that's right. I want to propose a toast, but it's too early in the morning for that. But my goodness, congratulations. 300 is a big deal.
Can't believe it. Crazy. I said to my wife, I'm like, It's coming up. I feel like something big should happen." So I figure what bigger thing to do than have Brian McLaren on the show.
Well, it's my honor. So thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to have you on today to talk about your new book, Life After Doom, an extremely important book, especially for the times that we're in. And I also wanted to reminisce with you a little bit
Yes,
because this is the
yes.
300th episode of the show, and it feels like I said something to celebrate. So, Brian, do you remember the first time that we met? Do you remember that?
You got to refresh my memory. Feels like I've always known you.
I
So,
know, right? Well, you were speaking at a Presbyterian church in Ridgewood, New Jersey.
okay. Yes, yes, yes.
Yep. And my daughter had just been born. She was like maybe like 3 weeks old, like really, really fresh. And I had just entered a doctoral program at a very evangelical school. And I got to chat with you for a few minutes in the basement of the church after you were done speaking. And we were having some refreshments. And I was in the middle of like this mega
Hmm.
theological crisis, which
Yes.
began years earlier. Thank you, Rob Bell and Love Wins, but was put into hyperspeed when my daughter was born. And
Yes,
I've talked about it on the podcast before, but she was rushed to the NICU. And
yes,
within minutes of being in the NICU tank, I got to reach my hand in there and she grabbed my finger. And I
yes,
had this thought, like as I looked at my own flesh and blood, and I thought to myself, the concept of original sin and hell is ridiculous to
yes,
me. And like
yes,
what a thought to have in the NICU, right? But like that was where
yes,
my mind was at because I was so engrossed in all things theology. And I felt like my theology was just imploding right there in
yes.
that room. And so fast forward, a few weeks, and you were speaking at this church. And so I dug out my McLaren books from seminary. I started rereading them, and I was like, "Man, this guy has answers that I'm looking for."
Mm.
And so I had reached out to you on Twitter. You were kind enough to answer many of my questions. We connected again at Wild Goose. You encouraged me to start the podcast. You've been on a bunch of times, and so Brian, I just wanted to say thank you for being with me on the journey.
Oh my
But that's where it all
gosh.
began.
Gosh, Glenn, when you tell that story about your daughter, it brings that back to me. And I just think what a profound experience. You felt a love in your heart that was so big
Right.
that you instantly knew the idea of a God who is supposed to be love and perfect love. Uh, you just saw, hold it, if I could feel that this much love, you know, uh, how could God have less? So, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
powerful moment.
Yeah, I
Powerful.
was thinking about like the song we'd always sing in church, he's a good, good father. And I
Yeah,
was like thinking to myself, like, I look at this little baby and I see absolutely nothing but perfection. I
yeah,
can't imagine her growing up to do anything that would make me feel anything less for her. Like I would move heaven and earth and the whole universe to do anything I could for
yes.
her. And I've only known her for like a few seconds. And like, how in the
Yes,
world could God possibly be any different? And it's just like all
yes,
the pat answers that I had, from all the different Bible verses I had memorized and all the systematic theology books, like it all just felt complete, utter meaningless in
yeah,
that moment.
yeah. It's fascinating how the experience of love could change things so powerfully. And that just feels right and fitting. Yeah.
That's right. And you can't, once you feel that, you can't undo it, right? Like you
Yes.
can't, like you see something or you feel something and you can't ignore it. Like it's always going to be there. And I feel like I could have tried to push that away, but it would
Yeah.
have stuck with me even if I tried to bury it.
And imagine if you'd succeeded in burying it, how much damage you would have done.
That's
And the
right.
only reason you would have tried to bury it or succeeded in burying it is because of the pressure of a religious community. uh, and the threats really of
That's right.
whether or not God would ever punish you. You can be sure the religious community would.
Right?
So,
Somebody's gonna punish you for sure. Yeah, and I did. I mean, to be honest with you, like I felt like the pressure to bury it, and like I tried to push it away for a little bit,
yeah,
and I can remember maybe she's like a month, 2 months old. I was laying with her on the bed. I was reading her a story from her children's Bible before bed one night, and
mm,
it was a story. I don't remember what it was, but the point of the story was, that God is angry at our sin and
yeah,
basically somebody's got to be punished. And it was said in,
yeah,
nicer terms than that.
yeah,
But I remember I closed the book and I said to my wife, I can't read this anymore. And she's
yeah,
like, what do you mean? I'm like, I don't believe this. So I don't know
yeah.
what I believe anymore, to be honest with you. I said, but I know it's not this. There's got to be something
Yes.
else. And that was just a moment for me that like I can't came face to face with it. And I was like, we got to do something.
Well, you and I were both raised in contexts where an awful lot of effort went into making us follow, some people called it the Roman road, or follow a little tracing of verses through the Bible, which required us to ignore a whole lot of other parts of the Bible.
That's right.
But there was a lot of effort in teaching us which verses should be read in which order, extracted from their original context, their original meaning, put into a fabric to make us accept a certain kind of a storyline.
Yeah.
Could I just share with you? I very seldom talk about these sort of things, but um, uh, an experience I had, not as dramatic or tender as yours, but
Hmm.
it was a powerful moment. I was a young evangelical preacher working on a sermon. And as I was doing my research, I don't even remember what the sermon was about.
Hmm.
I just sort of paused and closed my eyes, and I was overwhelmed, with a feeling that evangelicals and charismatics and others will understand if I say overwhelmed with a feeling of the presence of God. It was
Hmm.
just this, uh, yeah, hard to explain feeling of connection. And a sentence formed in my mind. I had never said this sentence. uh, it just formed in my mind. And the sentence was, "You have never had a thought of God that is too good."
Hmm.
And it was this sense that whatever God is, you know, it's better than your best idea.
That's right.
And it was this and I just remember feeling like sort of in a beautiful way silenced and a kind of pressure lifted. Like, I guess maybe I was feeling pressure for this sermon. I've got to honor God. And then to
Mhm.
just realize, yeah, God's beyond.
That's right.
And just to have those experiences in some ways, maybe it changes us in some way that affects the words that we say.
That's right.
Yeah.
It plants a seed for sure that
It
begins to
doesn't give
grow.
us it doesn't give us the words that finally get it all right, but maybe
That's right.
maybe it yeah.
That's right. And funny thing, when I went to see you speak at that church, I started rereading my favorite book of yours, which is The Secret Message of Jesus,
Ah,
which you
yes.
signed for me, by the way, that day.
That's
And I
great.
posted a picture of it on my Facebook page, and I was like really amped about this book because I had read it before, but it was through my more evangelical glasses, which were
Yes.
kind of coming off. And so now I saw it like in a much, much different way. But you would have thought from the comments that I got that I posted like a picture of my personal altar to Satan. I had so many people come into my direct messages and comment to warn me and scold me about much better books I could be investing my time in. But that gave me a chuckle.
That's wild. Hey, since we're reminiscing, I have a
Hmm.
memory of that time at that church. And I wonder if you were in this session where this happened.
Hmm.
And it's very relevant to what we'll talk about a little later about life
Hmm.
after doom, because I was talking about uh, our environmental crisis and our need
Hmm.
to energize people to get involved. And I'd mentioned civil disobedience, and a guy stood up. I think he was, I forget his exact age, but I think, was in his mid 80s or 90s or something, but he was up there.
Hmm.
And he said, "I'm ready. I've never done anything like this before, but I'm ready to get arrested or do whatever I have to do to try to make a difference." And
Yes,
and uh, and I just thought, it's funny. As soon as you brought that up, I remember that moment because I was so inspired by the guy. And then, as I recall, another woman of equal or greater age said, "Yes, something like, me too. Let's do this together."
that's
So
right. I
it's
do
yeah,
remember that. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember thinking to myself because again, like I was had more of myself was still in the evangelical
Yes.
mindset, and I thought to myself, "What is this? What is going on?"
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So before we talk about your new book, Brian, real quick, what is your advice for me as I continue to sail this ship past episode 300 into wherever it may go? What wisdom do you have for me?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is a story from my friend and colleague Richard Rohr,
Mhm.
who he's 81 now. I guess when he was 80, he might have been 79. Um, he was invited to meet Pope Francis, and of course, Richard is a Franciscan brother, and he and priest, and for a Catholic boy to spend 80 years of his life as a sincere Catholic, to get to meet, to be invited to come to the Vatican to have
No
a
small
private
thing,
meeting.
right?
Yeah, it's a really big deal. And he told me that when he met with Pope Francis, Pope Francis would ask him a question, he'd answer, and Pope Francis would say, "Just keep doing what you're doing. Just
Wow.
keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep at it. Keep doing what you're
Mhm.
doing." You know, that's what I feel when you say that. You're This podcast is touching people. You're growing, I'm sure, as you do it. You're creating a body of work that's
Mhm.
accessible to people around the world 24/7,
Mhm.
and this is good and important work. You've probably heard me say this before, Glenn, but Protestants often tell the story of Martin Luther posting 95 theses on the door of the Wittenberg Chapel, kind of like their version of a bulletin board for debate.
Yep.
But I think podcasts are the counterpart to that in
Mm,
our world today.
mm,
Um, there's a different economy,
yep,
there's a different intimacy, a different availability, and a lower entrance fee, in the sense that if you wanted to have a radio show or a TV show,
sure.
that requires a lot of money. And as soon
Yep,
as you're involved with a lot of money, certain other factors kick in. So I
yep.
would just say, especially someone like you who started from scratch and has taken others on your journey, I just think your best days could be in your next 300.
Awesome.
So,
I appreciate that. Thank you, my friend. You're the best.
uh,
All right. So
I,
let's talk about this book. Let's
yes,
tease people a little bit and pick at their interest. Uh, People, you've got to go get this book. It's a very important book. And it's so good. But like I said before we hit record, Brian, it's very, very heavy, right? I felt, to be honest with you, I felt sort of like a low grade depression near the first
yes,
half of the book. And I picked it
yeah,
up expecting, like, okay, this is going to be a quick read. It's got a bright blue cover, it's got this thing blooming out of the ground. And I thought to myself, this is going to be a good book. It's going to be a quick book, like I can just kind of blow through. But I got like halfway through chapter two and I put the book away for maybe even a month because I've had it for a while because my brain and my nervous system was just having a lot of trouble trying to process this doom that you present us with in light of my own evangelical baggage, which I'll
yes.
share maybe a little bit more about in a minute. But first, if we could begin, like, what can you give us like an overview of this book? Like, what's this book about? Who is this book for? Why did you write it? And maybe wade us into the waters of this doom a little bit that you're addressing, and then we'll see kind of where we go from there.
Sure, sure. Um, I wonder if I could just ask you a quick question first, though,
Yeah,
Glenn.
please.
Um, you'll remember that in chapter one, I say
Mhm.
something like, before you read chapter two, you really have to decide if you're ready for this. Um, and part of the thing I'm aware of, and this brings me to an answer to your question,
Yeah.
is that for people who have been studying climate change and the larger environmental crisis, and people who pay attention to politics, and
Mhm.
people who are uh, pay attention to economics and so on, and people who are aware of conflict and weapons and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, a lot of people are feeling this doom already.
Yeah.
And when they read the title, they think, oh, at last. For them, it's kind of like, I feel this already. I'm so glad to be able to open a book where we're going to be able to talk about this thing I feel that I'm not able to talk about, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's a whole lot of people who ha will have the response that you had, like, "Oh man, I sort of knew this was out there,
Hmm.
but I haven't really done the research, or I don't have other friends who are exposing me to this." And I'm guessing that part of the challenge of getting through chapter 2
Hmm.
was that it was a concentrated baptism into into information that maybe you just had never really had the time or need to look into. Is that a fair
It
assessment?
really was. I mean, when you said not to read the chapter, that made me want to read it more because that's just my
Yes.
mind. It's like, okay, you told me to stay away from it maybe if I needed to, but I'm gonna go look and see what this is about. And then it's true, like it's not a long chapter. It's not like it's 40 pages or something like that. It's
Yes.
a condensed chapter, but like you said, everything is put into this chapter, and you talk about these four different possible outcomes and things like that. And I kept looking for like the most hopeful outcome. And none of obviously, the outcomes, some of the outcomes are a little bit uh deeper and more severe than others, but there's not really a hopeful outcome, so to speak, when you think about
Yeah.
all this information that we have. And I think for me, like I'll mention a little bit later, it just triggered so much anxiety in me from like end times theology and all that kind of stuff that I
Ah,
was like,
yes,
oh
yes,
my
yes,
goodness, I got to put this away because
yes,
I felt like I was a little kid again, being afraid and being scared that the
yes.
world is going to end.
Yes. Oh my goodness. That makes so much sense
Yeah.
because I grew up with that kind of end times theology too.
Yeah.
I tell the story in one of my books that I came home from school one day. I think I was in third grade.
Mhm.
The door was unlocked and open. I went inside. My mother wasn't there. My brother wasn't there. It had
Mhm.
never happened to me before in my life.
Yep.
And I couldn't imagine any place they'd be.
Yep.
And I I walk through the house, nobody's there. I go and sit on the back porch, and I think the rapture happened. My parents and my brother are better people than me. I must not have been sincere when I said the sinner's prayer.
Yeah.
And I just thought, this is the end. I'm
Yeah.
on my own. There's nothing. And that was a trauma. I remember how intense it was, but I never wanted to even tell anybody about it. I felt embarrassed. It was
Yeah.
so it went so deep. And
Yeah.
so yeah, I can see how for folks like us with that kind of a background, any of this kind of talk can trigger all that stuff. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So what is like talk a little bit about like maybe for people who maybe more like myself who, like you said before, resisted some of this information, maybe kept it at
Yeah.
arm's length. Like I know it's out there. I know there's problems, but I'm just gonna kind
Yes.
of live through my life and hope things work out for the best. Like what are some of the what are some of the scenarios that we're talking about in
Yes.
this book in terms of the doom?
So let me just give a bit of background for
Hmm.
folks, Glenn. I in 2007, I wrote a book called Everything Must Change. And
Hmm.
that book was based, I'd written a book right before that called Secret Message of Jesus that you
Yep.
mentioned. And that book basically looked at Jesus' basic message: the kingdom of God is at hand.
Yep.
And I felt that what I wanted to do in that book is help others understand something that is unbelievably obvious, but that I hadn't seen because I've been so well trained as a fundamentalist or evangelical Christian to not see it.
Yep.
And that was that the kingdom of God is not what happens after we die. In the Lord's Prayer, we're taught to pray, may your kingdom come. In other words, come here to earth. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So it's something that comes to us here on earth rather than something we have to die and go to heaven in order to experience. Well, if the message of Jesus is that a new way of life, a new way of relationships, uh, could is available to us while we're here on earth, um, that would address the greatest problems we face. It raised the question for me: what are the greatest problems we face? So when I
Hmm.
wrote Everything Must Change, I began really not knowing, but it was a very innocent question. What are the biggest problems in the world?
Hmm.
And so that was my first baptism into paying attention to what the problems in the world are. When you're a little kid, as long as your family feels secure, you don't worry about these things. And when you're a teenager and you just want to get into a good college and get a good job, you don't worry about these things. I don't think you really start worrying about them until you have kids of your own.
Right.
And you wonder what will happen after I'm gone. And so that sets the context for this book, which is in many ways picking up where I left off with
Mm,
that book in 2018.
mm,
What has I, I I I I'm not happy about this, but the diagnosis that I reached after doing a really thorough lit review and having to opportunity to literally travel around the world, meet experts around the world, in writing that book, Everything Must Change, was that we're in a lot of trouble and we have some very, very serious work to do. And
mm,
the spiritual impact this had on me is it made me realize, gosh, what Jesus taught is really what we need. It's not just for afterlife, it's what we need to not destroy ourselves in this life.
yeah.
So so I've stayed up with the literature, uh, in these last 15 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and then wanted to do another deep dive to see where we are now. And
Mm,
so um, I could just do a quick overview of those
please
four
do.
scenarios if that'd
Yeah,
be helpful.
it'd be great.
So here's the thing people need to understand. We have a set of problems. We
Mm,
have a problem with our environment. We have a problem with our politics. We have a problem with our economics, and we have a problem with our religion. Um, each of those problems, like we might hope that religion would inspire us to solve the other three problems, but all too often, religion is making the other three problems worse.
it's like
And
the
so
gasoline. Right?
yeah, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And so, and each of these problems makes the others
Mm-hmm.
more difficult to solve.
Sure.
And so, it's like a person who starts off with a broken leg, and then that's one problem. But then because they can't get exercise while their leg heals, then they get a circulation problem, and then they get pneumonia, right?
Yeah.
Each problem is related to the others and makes it harder to solve. And so, what has happened in the years since I wrote that first book is that people have realized that there is a possibility, a growing possibility for civilizational collapse,
Mm-hmm.
um, where our nations implode, where our international relations implode. And so that is the backdrop for the four scenarios. Scenario one is collapse avoidance, where we wake up to our set of problems and we somehow find the will and the structures and the, the, the sort of people power to get our governments to address them. Uh, that's collapse avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
We do it before it's too late. The thing, as you said, that doesn't make that look easy is
Mm-hmm.
in order to deal with these things, it's going to create a lot of trouble
Yeah.
in the short between here and there. But
That's
collapse
what I
avoidance,
meant before, but like it sounds hopeful. But then if you think about it, it's like, well, how hopeful is this? Because how in the world are we going to get everybody on board to do this? You think of all the work, all the different things that have to go into getting everybody on board. It feels like it's, I don't know, it's feels hopeless. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
again, like
yeah,
it's a hopeful outcome, but it's a hope, feels like a hopeless process to get there.
yes. And interestingly, we're having this conversation. It was either 1 or 2 days ago. The leader of the whole climate uh, 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 coalition of scientists
Mhm.
is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Um, uh, and I guess this is from the United Nations where they're trying to coordinate all the efforts. He said, "We've got 2 years to get our act together. If
Wow.
we keep delaying, because 30 years ago people were saying we must act now, and so 30 years later it's like when does now run out?" And he
Yeah.
said, "We got 2 years, and at that point we cross certain lines that we don't want to cross."
Wow.
So collapse avoidance. Second is collapse rebirth, where collapse happens, but it's so painful, and we learn some lessons on the way down that we are able to come out of it and rebuild something that will be ecologically sustainable, that will be
Mhm.
more just uh, economically and politically, and that will just be changed somehow.
Mhm.
A lot of folks talk about a change in human consciousness that's needed for us to get to keep going. So that's collapse rebirth. The third is collapse survival. This theory says, or this scenario says, as we go down in this, we will create so much more damage. There'll be war, there'll be political division, there'll be authoritarians who rise and and almost like parasites feed on people's fear and anger and resentment and blame
Mhm.
and um, and we will end up in a situation where we cannot rebuild anything close to what we have built. So
Mhm.
our lives will some percentage of us will survive, but they won't be living anything like the lives that we're living now.
Mhm.
And then the fourth scenario, and people who haven't studied this might think this is ridiculous, but people who have understand how real this is. We could elevate the global temperature so much, and we could end up with a bunch of nuclear weapons going off in the process
Mhm.
of being angry at each other. We could put together a cocktail of trouble that could not only drive us extinct, but could drive, it wouldn't kill all the bacteria and it wouldn't kill the fish in the
Mhm.
deepest parts of the ocean, but it could kill an awful lot of life. It
Mhm.
could be what people are calling the sixth mass extinction event in the history of the Earth. So those are the four scenarios, and uh, and I wish somebody could convince me that there's another one, but I
Mhm.
think most people have all their hopes on collapse avoidance, and um, and you know, maybe we'll achieve that. That would
Yeah.
be that'd be great. But I think
Mhm.
one last thing I'll say
Mhm.
about this, Glenn, is that people who study risk management, um, here's what they'll say to us: the the more serious a risk, the more catastrophic a risk, the more effort we have to put into preventing it, even if it has a relatively low chance of happening. In other words, if it's a non-zero chance of happening and it's serious enough, we better take it seriously, right?
Yeah.
So, uh, uh, and we have examples of this that some people still haven't gotten used to. But you know, I've gotten in my car and driven somewhere I can't imagine hundreds of thousands of times
Mhm.
since I turned 16 and got a
Mhm.
driver's license. I've been in two accidents. Um, so that's a pretty low percentage of times I get in an accident. But I put a seatbelt on every single time I get in the car
Mhm.
because it's a non-zero chance of a very, very bad thing that could happen, right?
Yep.
I've driven thousands of times. I've never been drunk when I drive. Um, I might be able to get drunk. I've actually never been drunk, period. But if I were to drive drunk, I might get away with it. One, two, three. But the catastrophic possibility, not only for myself but for other people,
Yeah.
is so great that
Yeah.
we just say, don't take any chances with this. And we're trying to wake up in this way to our whole global economy and the
Yeah.
way our whole civilization runs. And the thing that's good about that is we had to do it sooner or later. And I think time has come for us to do it now.
Yeah. Yeah. So a question I have like that comes to my mind, and we've touched on this already, but maybe we could dig into it a little bit, is like what advice, what word of, I don't know, wisdom do you have for us like recovering evangelicals who again are triggered by this kind of stuff? Because I know a lot of my listeners fall into that category because people have told me that they kind of avoid this topic for that
Yes.
reason. And
Yes.
much like you, I was taught that doom is a good thing,
Yes.
right? Because global doom, catastrophe is a precursor for the end times, second coming of Jesus, and all these things. And the Christians, at least those of us who believe the right things, we're going to be raptured away from the
Yeah.
doom. And so, although we might feel it for like a little bit, we're going to feel the birth pangs. That was always a thing of the doom that's coming. We'd be off in heaven celebrating while the world is kind of burning and feeling the worst of it. So, I always struggle to read, like to make my way through this material, whether it's chapter two of your book or even like articles that I might come across like in the on the internet or like the New York Times or something like that, like kind of talking about, these possibilities, and the really very real possibility of one day there being like an end of human civilization, because it brings me back to middle school. Like I remember in sixth grade, our Bible class in a private Christian school, we went through the book of Revelation. We watched A Thief in the Night. You mentioned that book. You mentioned that movie in your book.
Yes.
And we talk about how like these things had to happen because they're actually good. And when I think
God
like
planned them. Yeah.
like my mind literally goes bananas, and like I just want to close the book and keep it all away. But my question is like, what about like for people who really want to engage this material,
Yeah.
really want to make a difference, but they're so triggered by the material that they want to keep it. There's like that inner wrestling match of I want to, but I don't want to. Like, what is
Yes.
your word of advice for somebody just to begin to wade into this stuff, to understand it, and maybe begin to do something to
Yeah.
help make some kind of a difference?
Well, the first thing I'd say is if anyone has a whole lot of trouble in their life,
Mhm.
you've got medical problems, you've got marital problems, you've got big problems with your kids, you're unemployed, you suffer from depression. Look, you got enough on your plate. You don't need to
Mhm.
read this book.
That's good.
That's the first thing I'd say, and
Mhm.
I say that repeatedly at the beginning of the book. You don't have to read this book. Um, there there are those of us though who uh, we are aware, sort of on our peripheral vision, things don't look really good, and for a period of time we say, I got enough on my plate. I can't think about it. I don't have the bandwidth for it, and but eventually the effort of keeping things at bay,
Mhm.
the effort of not thinking about it begins to drain us more than the challenge of facing it and thinking about it. So what I'd
Yeah.
say to people is, you don't have to. You really don't have to worry about it. Other people are worrying about it.
Mhm.
Um, and if your cup overflows with trouble, God bless you, take care of yourself, and others of us will do our work on this, right?
Yeah.
So that's what
Yeah.
I would say.
Yeah.
To folks, especially with a kind of, let's call it post-rapture trauma, right? But
Right.
post-rapture fundamentalist trauma will
Right.
come with PRFT. Um, for those of us with that kind of trauma, they might be interested, especially in a couple of chapters. I have a chapter in the book called "Don't Read the Bible," and then in parentheses, "The Same Old Way."
Yeah.
And what I'm proposing in that chapter, plus the chapter before it, especially, uh, I'm proposing that people like us who grew up in fundamentalist or evangelical settings, we were inducted into something like a cult.
Mhm.
And that cult did what a lot of cults, religious or political, do. It preyed upon our fear, and it in a sense tried to gin up fear, to manipulate us,
Mhm.
and to make us docile and compliant, and to uh, induct us into their uh, their project. Let's say it
Yeah,
that way.
sure.
Instead of a what if project, their project is a because we have the absolute truth. Here's what
Right.
you have to do. Right.
Believe it or burn.
The Believe It or Burn project.
That's
Yeah, there
right.
it is. And yeah, exactly. So, but what it might be actually a relief and somewhat fascinating to people to find out
Mhm.
is there is a different way of reading the Bible that actually helps us cope with reality rather than creates this sort of alternative fantasy.
Yeah.
And uh, I have to admit, I have come away from this writing project, as I explained in that chapter, realizing that some of my solutions to the fundamentalism I inherited create new problems. And I
Mm.
think there's a different way of dealing with this where we actually become more, we can align ourselves more with being part of the solution than being part of the problem.
Yeah. I appreciated those chapters a lot because I love the Bible. I mean, since I was a kid, I
Yeah.
thought the Bible was so interesting. I remember as a fourth grader sitting again in private Christian school. I can remember exactly where I was in the room where the teacher was telling us, the creation story, and telling us about how, the earth is 6,000 years old and like all these different things. and treating it like it was this history book, this science book. And I can remember having this thought as a fourth grader that this book seems way more interesting to me than that. You
Yes,
know, and like
yes.
I had no idea what that meant. But I can remember
Yeah,
thinking to myself, like, if this book is really, if some of these writings are really like 6,000 years old,
yeah,
and yet I find it on my shelf in 1994, whatever year it was, you know, and it endured all that time. There's got to be more to it than just being a
yes,
history book. And I can
yes.
remember having that thought, but having like read a little bit about your evolution of thought regarding the Bible and to how studying all of this material and looking at the Bible through the lens of this doom and of this hope and all these different things has really helped you even expand your views on the Bible today
Yeah.
was really inspiring to me. So I really found that very helpful.
Well, thanks, Glenn. And for just to give folks a window into this, if I could offer like one little
Mhm.
summary that might help them see that what we're talking about. There are all these apocalyptic passages. You find them in the Hebrew scriptures and the prophets. You find them in the Gospels, especially Matthew's Gospel. There are several chapters
Mhm.
that really sound like, Jesus is predicting the end of the world.
Yep.
And then the Book of Revelation has that feeling too. And that uh, this is me just offering my opinion.
Mhm.
The the people who taught us had made a very serious error in the way they interpreted those texts.
Mhm.
And they made that error not because they were bad people, but because other people had made
Sure.
errors in the way they taught them those
Right.
texts. But I feel like now I could offer this as a proposal. I actually truly believe this is true. I don't think any people anywhere in the Bible were talking about the end of the world,
Yeah.
meaning the end of the planet.
Mm.
I think they were using that kind of language to talk about the end of the world as they knew it,
Mm.
meaning the civilization they were part of, the culture, the society, the economy they were part of. And and I think when we have these deep emotional reactions to thinking about the end of civilization as we know it, we realize how embedded we are, entangled we are with our current civilization. Like,
Yeah.
let me just say it like this. Let's say instead of saying life after doom, and maybe I'll decide I should have done this in the book, I should have said life after cell phones. uh, because, like, if what we say is we could survive what we're going through, it would
Yeah.
just mean uh, life after fossil fuels. We'd
Mm.
have to imagine living without gasoline, coal, gas, and so on.
Yeah.
Well, for some people, that thought is so terrifying that it's almost like I'd rather die than live without gasoline. I'd
Yep.
rather, and uh, and I think that's how people felt in the ancient world. Like, imagine Jesus saying to people in his day, "Not one stone of the temple will be left on another."
Mm.
Now, what would that would be like someone saying to us, there will be no such thing as the Southern Baptist denomination.
Right.
There'll be no such thing as the Assemblies of God denomination. There'll be
Right.
no such thing as the Roman Catholic Church with its headquarters in the Vatican.
Yeah.
People who are devout Catholics or Baptists or Pentecostals would say, I can't imagine life wouldn't be worth living. My whole
Yeah.
life is oriented around this.
Yeah.
And but interestingly, that's what Jesus said to his
Mm.
compatriots. And
Mm.
guess what? The temple was destroyed. It wasn't destroyed because Jesus wanted it to be. Yeah, I think Jesus, or because God wanted it to be. I
Yeah.
don't think. I think Jesus said that not because he was foretelling the future. I think Jesus said that because he was smart and
He
he
knew it
looked
was coming.
around and he saw his fellow Jews planning to revolt against the Roman Empire.
Yep.
And he knew how empires worked because he was smart.
Mhm.
And he realized if we try to revolt against the Roman Empire, they will come in and humiliate the thing in which we take the most pride, which is the
Right.
temple, which, by the way, had been built by Herod, who got money from the Roman Empire. And this was
Mhm.
the way, one of the ways the Roman Empire controlled people is by putting up the money to build their temple so they would feel loyal, but then always having the threat that they'll tear the thing down
Yep.
if if you misbehave, right? So suddenly you look and you see Jesus just makes a whole lot more sense. He was warning people, keep living the way you're living. It's not going to go well for you.
Yeah.
And ironically, That's what we need to hear, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not punishment. It's not God is mad. It's God's warning us about this, we could say, because, you know, I mean, this is like a parent who's watching their 17-year-old kid start to snort a lot of cocaine.
Mhm.
And the parent pulls the kid aside and says, I love you. But this never turns out well.
Yeah.
And, you know, I'd love to help you get on a recovery program now, but I will still love you if you get arrested and if you drop out of school and if you ruin your health, I will still love you. In other words, you can have collapse avoidance, but if you have a collapse, I'll still love you.
Yeah.
And you might have a collapse that's so bad that you know you're never going to be able to have a job again. You might be permanently disabled, right? I'll still love you then, right?
Mhm.
So to me, that's a way that I think people could come out of uh, could gain a much deeper understanding, not only of how the world is working and the situation we're in, but also of the Bible that we love so
That's
much.
right. Yeah, and I think when you view the Bible through that particular kind of a lens, like all those apocalyptic pieces, it changes everything. Like it really changes the way that those stories speak to you. It changes the
Yes.
way, for me, it changes the way that like even my body feels about them when I read them because I can
Yes.
go back to those same passages like in Matthew and how they used to trigger me so much. But if I
Yes.
look at it through that lens, yeah, it might be triggering to a sense, but it's triggering for a different reason because now it's not so much about the end of the world, like you said, but it's about the end of life as we know it. And things
Yes.
are going to change drastically unless we get our act together. And I feel like for me, there's much more urgency in that sense than there is someday down the road, the whole world's gonna end, whatever.
Could,
Yeah.
could I add something to that,
Yeah,
Ken?
please.
And I honestly, I don't want to, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but this
Hmm.
is an honest hunch. Almost all of us, when we start in our journey, uh, for almost all of us, life is about us and
Hmm.
life is about me.
Yeah.
And then we become a little more mature and life is about me and my family.
Right.
And then life is about me and my political party or
Yeah.
religious tribe, or
Yeah.
it's about me and a larger group. Um, and eventually, I think we grow. Some of us never get beyond those early stages,
Mhm.
but some of us get to a
Mhm.
place where we say, life is about me as part of the whole human race.
Yeah.
And then I think some of us get to a point where we say, you know what? I don't exist if there aren't trees that are producing oxygen
Yeah.
and plankton that's producing oxygen out in the ocean. Every breath I take, I'm in a sense inhaling the oxygen that was made for me by plankton and rainforests. Ah, I'm connected. And the food I eat depends on millions of bacteria uh, and fungi and what people call mycorrhizal networks in the soil that
Mhm.
nourish plants that create the nutrition that I need to live another day.
Yeah.
I don't exist without soil. And suddenly we say, it's not just about me, and it's not just about my little tribe, and it's not even just about human beings. It's about life.
Yeah.
And one of my deepest hopes for this book is that it will help a lot of people, however they began the book, when they turn the last page, they'll be farther along in that journey.
Yeah.
Because I think that's the journey that the Spirit has been leading us on all
Yeah.
along, you know?
That's right. That's good. Do you have time for one more question, Brian?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
So thinking about this whole piece about the doom and just about the evangelical baggage, um, to be really honest with you, like one of the things I was thinking of when I was reading the book is I find it really hard to talk to people about this
Yes.
kind of stuff and
Yes.
about the material you present in the book because more often than not, I'm met with like we'll narrow it down to like two pieces of pushback that
Yes.
primarily comes from people in our former,
Yes.
especially more conservative evangelical tribe. And from what I've heard from podcast listeners, like they come across the same thing, whether it's at
Yes.
Thanksgiving dinner, around the
Yes.
table, whether it's at church, whatever. So number one, like I'm told there's no point fighting against it, right? Like it's inevitable.
Yeah.
The Bible says it's gotta happen. There's gotta be
Yes.
storms, Matthew. gotta be fires, there's gotta be war, all these different things. Like these things are happening because the Bible says they're gonna happen. So don't fight it.
Yes.
And rather than trying to save the planet, rather than trying to save our human civilization, whatever, we got to work on saving souls because that's what really matters.
Yes.
And so, like as you say in the book, and we talked about before, there's this arsenal of Bible verses, and they're thrown at you. And if you disagree, you push back. It's like, well, you're
Yeah.
like a crazy person, you know.
Yeah.
So I'll engage in this kind of conversation, but sometimes it feels like it's too much to bear because before we can talk about the science pieces, we have to talk about what the Bible actually is
Yes.
and what the Bible isn't. And that conversation typically explodes and kind of derails the whole conversation completely. So that's the
Yes.
first thing. And the second piece is I often think it like there's no such thing as global warming, right?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as any of this stuff because the earth is billions of years old,
Yes.
only been measuring temperatures, whatever, for X amount of years. And, the earth was around a lot longer than humans. And so the earth is going through these natural cycles, and you can present as much science as you want, and the individuals won't necessarily tell you that you're wrong, but just that it's all
Yes.
irrelevant right now. And so I guess like my question is like, what advice do you have for people again who are trying to enter into these conversations, but they're met with pushback because most people listen to the podcast are professionals talking to people who push back against ideas and beliefs because that's the deconstruction world. So we have that kind
Yes.
of background with us. But when it comes to this type of material, you're trying to make some kind of a difference. You're trying to help other people understand. Like, what is your advice for that pushback? Maybe some of your experience as well.
Yes. Uh, this could be
Another book.
it could be another book or a whole podcast, and it's a super important question. So, uh, let me say something in the language that all of us who grew up in these conservative religious homes will understand.
Mhm.
Um, Jesus sent out his disciples two by two among his fellow Jews. So these are people of his own religion.
Yeah.
And he says, I want you to go to a village. And if you find people of peace there, um, hang out with them and they'll be your hosts. And if you don't find anyone who's listening, then shake the dust off your feet and
Yeah.
go to the next town. And
Yeah.
as you leave, don't tell them, God damn you, you're all going to hell. Tell them, the kingdom of God has come for you as well. In other words, don't leave them with a condemnation of hatred. Just bless them. They're not ready. They're not
Mm.
prepared. Jesus told other parables to say, look, if the soil isn't prepared, nothing can grow.
Yeah.
So, what that says to me is there is a time to just say, these people aren't ready for this yet.
Yeah.
It's not where they are. Um, but that means then something else Jesus said, you got to find two or three other people. You got to find a couple people with whom you can speak freely. It's one of the reasons I said to you before, I think podcasts are so important. There are ways that in the privacy of my car, I can listen in on a conversation that I really, really need, but nobody in my social circle is ready for it.
Yeah.
And so that's what's very subversive about what's happening right now. People get a chance to listen in on conversations. And then in various ways, a lot of podcasters then help people find each other.
Yeah.
And it's very often that little Zoom groups form where people can talk and and you find those two or three people with whom you can talk. Uh, a brilliant writer named Margaret Wheatley calls these islands of sanity.
Mm.
And for a lot of us who grew up in evangelical backgrounds, we're watching our relatives become QAnon devotees, and we're watching our relatives join what looks a lot like a religious cult centered around a presidential candidate. Um, th- uh, they talk about indoctrinating cults. They have certain cable TV stations on morning to night. They even leave them on when they're out of the house as if to keep the house magically filled
Mm.
with the ether of what is to them the most it's giving their lives meaning and purpose. Someone to love, someone to hate. It's doing what religion used to do, right?
Yeah.
Um, uh, so that's the first thing I'd say is don't expect those people to get it or help you in the short run. But the other thing I'd recommend, another thing Jesus did in that context is he spoke in parables. And
Mhm.
what parables do is they create intrigue rather than confrontation.
Mhm.
And so my recommendation, the little script I've been recommending to people, we may have even talked about this before, but you wait for somebody to say something outrageous. And it might be they say, "Hey, what's new?" "Oh, I'm reading this book. It's called Life After Doom. It's really intense and I'm really interested in it." "What's it about?" "Oh, it's about, oh, that's just a hoax. That's a
Mhm.
Chinese hoax." Or they just pass on some talking points they heard
Yep.
from a politician, whatever. And then what I recommend you say is, "Wow, I see that differently."
Yeah.
5 words. "Wow,
Yeah.
I see that differently." And then almost always will say, "Well, what do you mean?" And then I would recommend you say, especially if other people are present, you say, "I'd be happy to go into it with you some other time in private. We don't need to talk about it now. But I just want you to know that's not how I see it." If you're interested in if you're really curious about how I see things and why I see them that way, I don't want to argue with you, but if you're really curious, ask me some other time. I'll be
Yeah.
glad to talk to you. Now, what you've just done is you've changed the game. Um, and the only reason you're going to be interested in talking is if they're actually sincerely curious.
That's right.
And if they are curious, they come talk to you and you say something and then they argue back. You say, Hold it, hold it. I thought you were curious about why I see things this way. I'll be glad to explain. I don't want to get in an argument with you because when we argue, it's your ego versus my ego. And my ego doesn't need that. Yours probably doesn't either, you know.
Yep.
So we just have to stay out of that argumentative tone because it only makes people dig their heels in.
Yeah.
That's what I could offer to people
Yep.
to try to survive in these crazy times. Yeah.
I love that because in our last conversation, I think I forget the title of your last book off the top of my top of my head, but you brought up that very same point in reference
Yes.
to talking to people about God and
Yes.
faith and deconstruction, because a lot of people, again, coming up against that pushback. And you said to bring up that phrase of, wow, I see that very differently. And that disarms the other person because they've got all their guns ready to blaze, but then
Yeah.
it's like, well, I see that differently. And then it's, well, you have a choice now. You can keep attacking, or you can say, well, what do you mean by that? Which then opens up some kind of a conversation. So a lot of people have said to me that has been very helpful to them in
I'm
their
glad.
deconstruction process. So I think that would be equally as helpful for people in this process, because you can bring the same thing that you've been practicing in terms of your faith and your understanding of the Bible and those kind of conversations into this conversation as well. So I love that. Keeping it
And
simple
that's
is what
right.
I need.
And let me just add one thing that might be helpful to folks.
Yeah.
If we, if I have come to a point in my life, other people might not see it this way, but I've come to a point in my life where I think that our theological beliefs are not in a hermetically sealed jar separated from our political and economic beliefs.
Yeah.
And the reason people believe what they believe theologically is often on an unconscious level because of the economic system they're part of, the cultural system they're part of, and this religion helps them find their niche
Right.
in that system. And so if what and suddenly a word that Jesus used a lot, a word repent, which triggers a lot of us because we heard it to say, stop thinking for yourself and listen to what I'm saying to you
Mhm.
and agree with me as the preacher, or
Yeah.
you'll burn in hell.
Yeah.
The word repent means the very opposite. It means have the courage to think differently from
That's
the
right.
people who are telling you there's only one way to see things.
Yeah.
So
So good. Brian, we're just about out of time, but this has been so much fun. Thank you for joining me for episode 300. Thank you for your work, your friendship. I appreciate you.
I feel the same way. God bless you and all the good people who listen.
Thank you. Real quick, is there anywhere you want to point people to maybe interact more with this work, or anything else with you have out there?
Well, it's kind of the main place is brianmclaren.net,
Okay.
BrianMclaren.net. And that they'll
Perfect.
find links to social media and stuff there.
Great. I'll put it in the show notes and we'll do it again soon.
Thanks, man.
I'm okay, I'm okay. 난 괜찮아, 괜찮아. 이제 그만 날 피하지 마. 그 분명한 말도 안 돼. 나를 봐봐. 널 위해 많이 고민했어. 고른 멜로디. okay, I'm okay. 넌 괜찮아, 괜찮아. 다 이겨낼 걸. 무서울 게 없잖아. When I know that 이제 그만 숨지 마. 고개를 들어 나를 봐주길 바래. 우리는 언제나 영원해. 나를 봐봐. I think about you every day. 꿈을 꿔봤자 하늘에 소리 질러봐. 힘을 내줘. 이렇게 힘을 내줘. 어디로 갔는지 몰라도 우리 함께 alright 손을 잡아. 힘을 내줘. 내 곁에 서라면 그대 늘 바랬던 It's my life. 너와 꿈을 향해 이 노래를 부를게. 이토록 아름다운 곳 우리는 힘을 합쳐 이곳을 함께 지켜 tonight. Yeah. 여기 내 손을 잡아 너의 꿈을 안을게. 이제 나 이렇게 우리 함께 힘이 돼줄게. 네가 어디 있건 간에 내가 힘이 돼줄게. 이제 내 손을 잡아. 줄게.